just saw that beautiful barbed wire going up today. It was barbed wire used properly can be a beautiful sight.
Election week 2018, and President Trump's closing argument is all immigration all the time, as he announces the deployment of thousands of troops to the border. But the Pentagon is asking questions.
So they asked the Department of Homeland Security to go back to the White House to see if they really needed this, to work with the White House to grant U.S. military, grant the Department of Defense additional authorities to perform law enforcement on U.S. soil.
Only in America.
Only in America.
Only in America.
Only in America.
Only America.
Only in America.
And my conversation with León Krauze, the Mexican-born journalist and broadcaster, who is worried for the future of democracy.
Media only talk about immigrants when it has to do with some sort of punitive thing on the border, deportation, blah, 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 or when it has to do with crime. What would happen to the meat industry if the undocumented left tomorrow, to the dairy industry, to the service, hospitality community, construction, oh man, construction. If really tomorrow every undocumented immigrant left, construction in this country would grind to a halt. No one's telling those stories. No one.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Nirani with Only in America. My guest this week is author and journalist León Krauze. Born in Mexico, León grew up wanting to cover U.S. politics, a goal he reached in the late 1990s, working for media outlets both here and in Mexico. Now, he wears many hats. León is the news anchor for Univision's KMEX in Los Angeles, a contributor to the Daily Beast and the New Yorker, and a columnist for El Universal in Mexico. And he hosts a weekly podcast, El Gabfest in Español, for Slate magazine. We talked about the Trump presidency, León's challenge to U.S. Latino voters, and most importantly, we talked about mangoes.
I'm here at the Tribune Festival to moderate a panel on the bilateral relationship between Mexico and the United States. I had this very interesting conversation with former ambassadors Jacobson and Garza, because as you know, our listeners know, that particular relationship that's so rich, that has such a deep historical background, has been so complex for so many years, is going through a difficult time, unfairly so. And that's what brings me here. What brought me to the United States was, first of all, my passion for American politics. I've always studied American politics since I was honestly a kid. I mean, I remember when my friends were out drinking and having lots of fun. In high school, I was watching Al Gore debate Ross Perot on NAFTA. So I was a kind of peculiar young Mexican who then became a journalist, and I always wanted to come here and develop my craft in the United States. And then I slowly also began to learn about the immigrant experience. My own family is mostly made of immigrants. My father is first generation Mexican. My family came from Poland in the early 20th century to America, the continent, not the country, to Mexico. And so that's always been part of the family's narrative, and it has become a crucial part of who I am. I like to think of myself as a narrator of the immigrant experience, and that's what I like to do the most, what I do nowadays for Univision.
So tell me a little bit more about your father's journey from Poland to Mexico. How is that part of your DNA and how you look at the immigrating experience to the U.S. now?
Well, I should point out that for me, when I say first generation, I mean first generation born in Mexico. My grandparents were the ones who emigrated when they were very young, in the early 1930s. All of my father's family emigrated from Poland to Mexico, seeking a better life. And I grew up listening to their stories or listening to their relatives tell their stories, because I only had the privilege of meeting one of my great-grandparents, which is an enormous privilege in itself. Those stories have stayed with me. I know that my great-grandfather had the intention to go to Canada to meet with his brother, who was already living there, and he went to Mexico on his way to Canada, stopped in Veracruz, the beautiful Mexican seaport of Veracruz, and came down the ship with his luggage, and here comes a small Mexican kid who convinced him. Of course, my great-grandfather had no knowledge at all of Spanish, but I don't know how he convinced him of leaving his bags with him, with the kid, and so that my great-grandfather could have a walk around, which he did. He enjoyed the views, he drank a cup of coffee, and when he came back hours later, the kid was there, apparently, or so the legend says, eating a mango, sitting on top of my great-grandfather's big pieces of luggage. And he decided right there that he would stay in Mexico. And he sent a letter to his brother saying, listen, I'm sorry, I'm staying here. Good luck in Canada, see you soon. Sent another letter to his wife saying, you're no longer coming to America to go to Canada, we're actually coming to Mexico. I bet my great-grandmother was slightly surprised, but it ended up being a very good decision because Mexico was very welcoming, and they built a life in Mexico, as did the other side of my father's family. And these stories have always been with me and inform and illustrate and guide the kind of journalism that I like to pursue nowadays.
Plus, the mangoes are much, much better in Mexico.
Honestly, yes, and that it does not surprise me that you say that, because I guess you're a connoisseur, but they are. The Manila mangoes, you cannot find them anywhere in the United States, and our mangoes are just delicious. Yes, that's cruel. Yeah. That's cruel to remind me of the mangoes.
We could have an entire conversation just about the fresh mangoes. They're amazing. They're nothing better.
Absolutely agree. People, when you go to Mexico, first thing you do, you go grab a mango.
All right, let's segue from mangoes to politics.
For a second, yes.
United States politics is a mess, right? What's your sense of kind of where we are right now, but actually more importantly, where do we go from here?
Well, it saddens me deeply because, again, the reason why I came to the United States was I have always admired American democracy. My father's a historian who has studied democracy forever, and that was the other side of my intellectual upbringing and emotional upbringing even, to value American democracy. I've always admired it. I still do. In spite of what's going on now, I still do. I hope that this is just a phase. And it has to be just a phase, because I believe that America's institutions are strong enough to withstand this attack that we're seeing now. Because I do believe, without exaggerating, that what we're seeing is an attempt to, let's say, sway America's institutions to an area, to a place where they don't deserve to be. As a man who has studied American history, I think that the Founding Fathers were a unique generation, probably the best intellectual generation that the world has seen in centuries. And I think they were careful enough to procure a country that's strong, institutionally speaking. But again, that's my hope. When we see things like what we've seen with the process of confirmation to the Supreme Court of Judge Brett Kavanaugh, you start thinking, man, even the strongest democracies can ultimately fail if enough people inside that democracy, inside the system, work against it. I hope that doesn't happen in America, and I'm optimistic, but still, anything could happen.
What is the role of the Latino community, the Mexican immigrant community, in revitalizing American democracy in the ways that you would like to see it revitalized?
I'm actually disappointed when I think of the Mexican-American community, when I think of the Hispanic community in general. I'm disappointed. And I know this is a controversial position, but what disappoints me is turnout, is the lack of leadership. When I think of specifically the Mexican-American community, although I completely understand there are many things that make, for example, a comparison with the Cuban-American community unfair. Cuban Americans enjoy the complete safety of their immigration status from the moment they step inside the country, and the same cannot be said of Mexican Americans. But I think that there comes a time in which excuses run out, and there are really not many figures out there that I think we could point to with regards to leadership. No, I can go back to people like Kevin De León, for example, who is now running for Senate in California. But there are not many more, and that saddens me, that there are not enough political leaders coming out of that community. And, like I said in the beginning, that turnout is not what it should be. When I think of, for example, the election in a number of districts, the midterm elections in a number of districts here in California, Hispanic voters should be turning out to vote in record numbers, and they haven't. And if after what we have seen from Trump and from the Republican Party in the last couple couple of years, but even before that, Hispanics still decide to not register, to not vote, it starts being beyond irritating, worrisome, because you've given up the opportunity to really take part in American political life. And as immigrants, you have to do that. It's part of the contract with this country. You take part in its political life. If you want to run for office, cool. You should if you want. But at the very least, register and vote. And not enough people do that from the Hispanic community, and that saddens me.
And do you see a difference between the older generations and the younger generations in terms of that civic engagement culture, or is it all the same and kind of a lack of leadership and energy?
That's a very good question. I do see a difference. I think that younger generations tend to be more engaged. You see that in the way they're participating during the Trump years, for example, when you see people marching, protesting, taking part in this other life of political life, which is very important to make your voice heard and all that. But again, the act of voting is crucial, and I don't think the numbers support a real difference between older generations and younger generations. I know that there are people out there who disagree, but even if the difference was there, even if we could find numbers that show that young people are really much more engaged than their parents and grandparents, I bet that those numbers are not sizable enough, not remarkable enough to consider that the younger generation is really making a difference like they could. And that again saddens me, and I don't really understand why, because it's very simple. Democracy, as fallible as it is very simple. You register, you listen, you decide, you vote. And then you apply pressure when a politician decides not to keep his promises or her promises. That's the way democracy works. And you know what? It's very simple. So when not enough people understand that, and especially when you compare it with other demographics that are doing it on a regular basis and do turn out to vote and do understand that you have to do this and that with your elected officials, then it starts becoming dangerous because you are underrepresented and your rights and your interests are not defended and represented enough. And that very easily leads, let's say, a subclass of citizens, and we cannot allow that.
So earlier this summer, there was the tragic murder of Molly Tibbetts in Iowa, and you wrote a column about that murder. It broadened the conversation, the perspectives dramatically. How did you find that story? And if you don't mind kind of going back through that column a little bit.
I was taken aback by the details surrounding the brutal murder of Molly Tibbetts in Iowa. I was terribly saddened by the murder itself, obviously, such a remarkable young woman, but also by the fact that an immigrant committed the murder. That saddened me because I knew the way that conservative media and Republican politicians, and then it turned out even the President of the United States, were going to react, focusing not on the crime itself, but on the specific context of this young man's life, meaning that he was an undocumented immigrant. I followed that reaction. That turned out exactly how I expected. But then 1 month after Molly Tibbetts was killed, this other young girl, equally remarkable young girl, a semi-professional golfer from Spain, an immigrant herself, as a student in Iowa, was brutally killed again in the golf course by a young white male, American-born male, who was also homeless and had a criminal history. And so I started following how the same media outlets were reacting to this very similar crime. And of course, when it came to a man like the murder of Ms. Barkin, the last name of this woman, no one in conservative media, not one politician, not one of the senators, of Iowa's 2 senators, or of course not the President of the United States, no one thought it important to remark on this young man's context. They didn't speak about him being homeless. They didn't say, well, this homeless man did this, let's criminalize every homeless person in America, which is something they do with immigrants. No, they take an individual case and use it to criminalize the universe, the collective. And so I wrote about that double standard that I still see, and I think we will keep seeing in American conservative media and in American conservative politicians. And I said this is exactly the kind of thing that fuels nativism. And I think that's absolutely true. I mean, when you see, for example, the numbers of people among Republicans, how many have a good opinion of Mexico? Only 38% of them do. versus 60-something% of Democrats. Why? Because they have been to Mexico, because they know Mexican people, because they have Mexican friends, because they're informed correctly? No. And there are polls who prove that these people don't know anything about Mexico. They think that way about Mexico and about immigrants, if you ask them, because of what they hear in the media. And that's incredibly irresponsible. And so that's why I decided to write that story.
But it also, when we started talking, you talked about the panel you did here today on NAFTA and trade. And my sense is that many Americans who don't have a personal relationship with somebody from the Mexican community, their assumption is that it's going to be the Mexican next door who takes their job or the Mexican in Mexico who takes their job. So these two issues have been conflated in the minds of many Americans. And how do we help people understand Mexico as a community, as a country, is not a threat, or rather it's an asset or a partner?
Through verifiable, honest information, which is not something that many news outlets in America do nowadays. Because at the same time, like I was describing how Fox News behaves and the Tucker Carlsons of this country behave, but then you have established news media that are supposedly impartial, like the big networks, for example. There are studies, like I can think of a specific one from Columbia University, that have studied, again, analyzed this question in particular, and have come up with a devastating conclusion. Networks, media almost in general in America, especially mass media outlets, only talk about immigrants when it has to do with some sort of punitive thing on the border, deportation, blah, 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 or when it has to do with crime, like the Molly Tibbetts case. No one talks about what immigrants do for this country, how crucial they are for an enormous number of industries in this country, what would happen to the meat industry if the undocumented left tomorrow, to the dairy industry, which is brutal. I think that milk would jump like 70% from one day to the next, to the service, hospitality community, construction. Oh man, construction. I mean, if really tomorrow every undocumented immigrant left, construction in this company, that's actually a good Freudian slip, in this country would grind to a halt. No one's telling those stories. No one at all. So I think that's an enormous problem. Because if you did tell those stories, then you would see an immediate change. I go back to how the travel ban ultimately failed. Why? Because the media started telling the stories of the immigrants, of the Iranian grandma who couldn't come to her grandkids' graduation, about the student who couldn't come back to MIT. So the American public started realizing, man, this policy is nonsense. It's cruel. It's wrong. So that's what media should be doing with the current story of immigrants in this country, and they're just not doing it.
So in this, let's just say, complicated times, what gives you hope?
I'm a firm believer in the United States and in the ideals that led to the building of this amazing nation. Like I was saying, I think that the founding fathers were remarkable people, and their ideas and ideals are still with us in many ways. I think that also the American identity has always had two sides. This is a country that elected Barack Obama. This is the country that has been built for, from, by the immigrant experience. But this is also the country of nativism. This is also the country of Donald Trump. This is also the country that reacted so negatively to Italian immigrants, Irish immigrants, immigrants from Asia, Germans, including the Trump family. Many people, for example, don't know or just don't understand that in the 20th century it was Hispanics, Mexicans. But in the 19th century, the big wave of immigrants were Germans. So it's part of the American identity. And precisely because it's part of the American identity, I think that the better angels of our nature will eventually emerge. Also, what gives me hope is democracy. American democracy works, and every congressman will face an election sooner rather than later. The president will face an election sooner rather than later. And the American people have proven that they are wise in the end. Not infallible, but certainly wise. So what gives me hope is this country itself. I may be a romantic, but that's what I believe.
If we don't have hope, it's hard to get out of bed in the morning.
Exactly.
Right. So last question for you. And you have the incredible luck or fortune to talk to an incredible amount of people across the country, from community members to politicians. The name of the podcast is Only in America. So finish this sentence. Only in America, ...
Only in America could my two younger sons, Alejandro and Santiago, share their lives with their very proudly immigrant older brother who considers himself both Mexican and American and is surrounded by friends from all over the world who think of this country as their own, even if they themselves immigrated to the United States. This country has, the current moment notwithstanding, and even in the current moment, has always had its doors open for people like us, for people like myself, who love it, who cherish it, who learned English here in America, who chose this country as the birthplace of their children and hopefully their children's children, and your family as well, and millions of others. Only in America can that happen, and it will continue to happen. The nativists, it doesn't really matter what the nativists think, because in the end, the better angels of America will triumph. I'm sure of it.
Thank you, Leon. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, brother.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the James Irvine Foundation, expanding opportunity for the people of California, and from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, established in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie to promote the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding.
León Krauze is a Mexican journalist based in Los Angeles. There's more about him at our website, immigrationforum.org, where you can also subscribe to Only in America, which comes to you every week from the National Immigration Forum. Now, while you couldn't give me enough money to predict which party will emerge victorious on Tuesday, I am certain of one thing. Regardless of who wins, this campaign season shows us how much we've already lost. President Trump has framed the Republican Party's campaign message around caravans of, quote, invaders, and he's deployed the military to the border to lay barbed wire. Now, to their credit, the military would like to stay out of politics and is pushing back on the White House. As Brian Brown reported for CNN.
So they asked the Department of Homeland Security to go back to the White House to see if they really needed this, to work with the White House to grant U.S. military, grant the Department of Defense additional authorities to perform law enforcement on U.S. soil. Now, this is, of course, a long-standing legal issue, posse comitatus, whether or not U.S. forces can perform these functions, even in extreme situations. So this is why the request was turned down. It's not clear whether or not the White House is considering granting those additional authorities. But again, over 8,000 U.S. troops staging, getting ready to deploy to the border. Some of these forces DHS wanted to perform this law enforcement function. That request, for now, turned down by the Pentagon.
Clearly, Trump sees immigration as the issue around which to organize his base. Last week, Politico's Gabby Orr reported on some concerns that are coming from Republican corners.
Several Republican operatives and officials described a growing sense of fear within the party over Trump's hardline rhetoric on border security, which he has repeated nearly every day for the past 3 weeks. You are playing at the margins with Republicans on the issue of immigration, but there are very many more Democrats that might be mobilized by his rhetoric, said conservative radio host and the resurgent editor Eric Erickson, who called Trump's immigration-heavy closing pitch not smart politically in a tweet earlier Thursday.
But with few exceptions, the Democratic response has been to avoid the issue of immigration altogether. If anything, leadership has ceded the Democratic position on these issues to the most left-leaning members of the party. Roberto Suro wrote in the Washington Post last week, quote, Democrats are not contesting immigration this year. Republicans mention immigration 4 times as often as Democrats in campaign ads. 50% of pro-Democratic ads aired in September were on health care, compared with just 4% on immigration. As Republicans consolidate and energize their base around the president's immigration message, Democrats are banking on Latino turnout in opposition to Trump, not in support of a constructive vision. And Democrats hope suburban, independent, and moderate voters will just follow suit. Buried in this rhetorical haze over election is actually the real crisis, a crisis of poverty and social chaos, not at our southern border, but in Guatemala and Honduras. The solution there is within grasp of both sides of the political debate here. Devote resources to independent immigration judges who will consider claims for asylum fairly and accept or reject them quickly. Invest in the economic and social rebuilding of Central American countries. Establish in-region refugee processing centers so people are not forced to make a long and dangerous journey. But here's the rub. The independent and moderate voters who are going to determine the outcome of this election want exactly these kinds of solutions. And they're solutions that nobody is talking about, Republicans or Democrats. In fact, every day there is more and more evidence that troop deployments, separations of families, and vitriolic words are turning these voters away from the Republican Party. But Democrats are not taking advantage. So all to say, on Tuesday, Republican victories will come at the expense of who we are as America, and Democratic victories will come at the expense of failing to describe who America is becoming. And that's all for this week. Don't get too busy to vote. Only in America is produced by Regina Medina and Emily Chow. The executive producer is Kathleen Farrell, with thanks as always to the staff of the National Immigration Forum. I'm Ali Noorani. See you on the other side of the election.